This time on Poll Hub, it's the end of week 2 of Convention Palooza, now that the GOP has done its thing. But is any of it going to make any difference in November? We're looking at polls new and old to discuss that. Then, speaking of November, voters seem to be getting more excited. But is there a partisan difference? There may be. But we'll explore why that storyline may be missing a much bigger trend. And now that a big majority of Americans get at least some of their news from social media, why do a majority believe social media platforms are censoring political views? We've got a lot to cover this time, so let's get to it. And hi, everybody. Welcome to Poll Hub. I'm Jay DeDapper, Director of Innovation at the Marist Poll.
And I'm Barbara Carvalho, Director of the Marist Poll.
And I'm Lee Miringoff, Director of the Marist College Institute for Public Opinion.
So it is rare in American politics. We have back-to-back conventions. I think it did happen once before I had read, and it's sticking in my mind, but I can't remember when it was. But back-to-back Democratic and Republican political conventions this year are a reality, and we're just wrapping up with the Republicans. Impressions, does it make any difference? Did the Democrats make any difference? Is anybody going to be talking about these things 2 weeks from now?
It's probably going to have about as much coverage in 2 weeks as the impeachment hearings, which were supposed to be all we were going to talk about this summer and fall. These are very scripted affairs, and I think that they were interesting from a political communications standpoint because it's a whole new world for campaigns to try to figure out how to run conventions, which may have sort of seen their day anyway, and this may only expedite that. Having said all that, Joe Biden's numbers in terms of his favorability went up a little bit as a result of the Democratic convention, and I don't think that's a huge surprise. I think that during the Republican convention, there was an attempt to make sure that Joe Biden's slight blip in his favorability was not going to be long-lasting. And I think both sides were trying to sort of address problems that they think the candidates have, and we can get into that in more detail. But as far as any huge movement, we've talked about the era of post-convention bounces, which hasn't been around for a long time, and certainly we would expect isn't going to be prevalent this cycle either.
I don't think I was surprised that each convention took the opportunity to bash the other side, but I think I was a little surprised about the fact that they spent so much time on the character of their nominee. So in a sense, I saw both conventions as focusing on us getting to know each of these candidates a little bit more as, empathetic people, as people who could, feel our pain, as Bill Clinton used to say back in the 90s, and could really connect with average Americans. So for Biden's side, I get the idea that they need to give us a better sense of who he is as a person and who he would be as president. But on the Trump side, I just thought more time was going to be spent on the issues of the pandemic, the economy, and racial inequality. I mean, certainly the Democrats spoke to race and those issues, and mostly in the context of what the president has not been doing. But I was really taken aback that it was all about feeling good about the presidential nominee from both parties.
One thing that I question coming out of both of these is we have said repeatedly, certainly I've said it a lot for a long time, and I'm a big proponent of this, that this election is entirely about Donald Trump. Am I wrong, though, after this? Because if it's only about Donald Trump, the Republicans believe that, and they think maybe they can make that a winning issue. But for Democrats, can it still only be about Donald Trump if the alternative is somebody that you don't know very well? Because it seems like they spent at least some of their convention trying to get people to pay more attention to Joe Biden. Does this coming out of these two conventions, does this race become less about only Trump and more about Trump and the alternative to him?
Well, I think it becomes ultimately more of a choice. The Democrats clearly, as long as the president's approval rating remains way below a winning number, then they're going to try to keep Joe Biden out of this, which is why when he said he was going to, close down, things again to get the coronavirus under control, that may have been, an unforced error on his part. Because that became something now, just something we can say about him. Get to Barb's point, though, you almost get the feeling that both campaigns are looking at the same private campaign data, in that the next 4 years, people want a more civil tone in Washington coming out of the White House than what we've had. So Donald Trump is now being portrayed as kind of like a nice guy if you get to know him. And Joe Biden is, again, the character and all those things.
Uncle Joe.
Yeah, Uncle Joe and all those things.
Joey.
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 Look, I thought it was interesting. The Republicans clearly were trying to address the whole racist attack of the Democrats, and Herschel Walker and others, playing a outsized role in that. But I think the Democrats, and I'm curious in both your reactions, Ron Brownstein has talked about a blind spot, and we've talked about this before, that the Democrats need to be Joe Biden has to be the answer if the economy becomes front and center, because people think a vaccine, if not there, is at least around the corner coming up. I sort of agreed with Brownstein. There was an attempt to talk about the economy, but it was much more about race relations and the coronavirus and Joe Biden's character. So I was just surprised they didn't really offer a concrete proposal on the economy, as far as I was concerned, from the Democrats.
Look, in 2016, the Hillary Clinton campaign made the judgment that Trump was so unacceptable to Americans that he would eventually just fall on his own sword. And the focus was pretty much on Trump, the person, and his character. We all know how that turned out. So to me, it's a little surprising that the Democrats seem to be going down that same road. Granted, there's a lot to be said now after 4 years of Trump, particularly in the midst of the pandemic. But I do think that they make a mistake by not having an alternative. Now, we've done some polling along with a number of other public polls that have shown that in addition to Biden having a lead one-on-one, with Trump, he's also ahead among people's perceptions of who could best handle race relations, who could best handle the coronavirus. But he's neck and neck with him when it comes to the economy, and he's actually been behind at other points during the last several months. So I think it is a door left open, and I think it is somewhat surprising that there wasn't more about the economy at the convention. Now, granted, Biden did talk about that in his acceptance speech, and especially with regard to infrastructure, green jobs, and I'm sure if we were having a drinking game, we would have gotten pretty drunk on the number of times that he said. But I don't think it's a cohesive message. I don't think it's a cohesive theme that they're really emphasizing.
Yeah, Jay, before we move on, I just wanted to ask you, Barbara and I have been to a share of conventions. As a political journalist, you've gone to a zillion and a half conventions.
Not
that old. Come on,
just a zillion. Just wanted to ask you, a lot of reporters were kind of missing the opportunity to get to get it up close and personal in light of the quarantines and the pandemics. Did you, was that something that you could comment on, having been someone who partook in those?
Well, honestly, conventions haven't had news to cover for a really long time. And most of the time, reporters at conventions spend their days going to delegations or talking to people, trying to find some kind of human interest story or something. And then you spend that convention night basically, to some degree, transcribing what you just seen, what people have just watched in prime time. It was always struck me as odd that I was expected to come on the air immediately after the convention speech finished at 11:15 or whatever, and let's go to Jay, who's on the convention floor with a story on, well, you've just watched the entire thing. And so it became more of a perspective thing. I think, look, it was interesting to see the way the conventions were done. I think reporters obviously felt like they're watching at home like everybody else. I'm not so sure that that's a whole lot different from what reporting on conventions for most reporters in the biggest sense has been for quite a long time, which is commenting on what everybody's watching on TV.
Now, one of the things conventions have always I should say have always done, and it's probably the only thing they've done in recent years, is raise the hoopla factor, the enthusiasm factor for each campaign. And as far as I'm sure, we saw some fireworks. We haven't seen any balloons. There wasn't that. There was some
I think
interesting.
there was some virtual confetti.
Confetti, yes. And so, okay. So what we deal with though here is what is about this enthusiasm factor that is, what 2020 may turn out to be all about. And we see that over time, and I don't think this is surprising, that the enthusiasm of Trump supporters has been higher than the enthusiasm for the Biden supporters. And in fact, Republicans generally are showing a slight advantage in terms of enthusiasm. And enthusiasm overall has gone up since April in the Gallup numbers from 59% to 71%. But as Jay indicated in the introduction, enthusiasm may not be the full story here. So Jay, why don't you take a swing at it?
Yeah, the only reason that we say that is something we've now talked about a couple of times over the last few months, which is that all polls, and we looked at our own, we dug into our own, but every national poll is showing this same trend, which is that remember when we ask people if you're a Republican or Democrat, we're asking people, do you identify as a Republican or a Democrat? We're not using voter rolls and things like that to identify people, how they're registered. So that is self-selecting. And when Republicans love their party and are enthused by it, or people who identify as Republicans, they're going to say they're Republican in larger numbers than when they're bummed out. Same with Democrats. Democrats weren't so excited to say they were Democrats in 2010 after, the first 2 years of the Obama administration and the Tea Party and all that. And so it looked like there were fewer Democrats. It's not that there's fewer Republicans and fewer Democrats at any given time. It's there's fewer people identifying as one or the other. And the number of people identifying as Republicans has been falling. It's been falling over, in our polls, when we looked at it, most of the Trump term since 2016. And so when you have a smaller number of people identifying as Republicans, they're going to be more enthusiastic. They're going to be a more enthusiastic bunch, right? These are the more hardcore, if you will. That's the assumption I think you can make. And so the enthusiasm among Trump supporters, you would think would be higher right now than it would be among Democrat and Democratic leaners, especially as the number of independents or people who say, I don't want to be associated with either party, that's what continues to grow. And, their enthusiasm is not measured in a lot of polls in the same way that this RD split is measured, for instance, in this particular
And
poll.
the reverse of that is also as you get newfound support, which Joe Biden clearly has over the course of his campaign this year, become, seen as electable and all that. The first group who adds to you are not going to be intensely supportive of you. They've just found you and have now support you. And the other thing is all the negative partisanship. It doesn't take necessarily enthusiasm about a candidate to get you to vote in a certain way, because you just may dislike, as we've talked about in the past, the other candidates more. Barb, we always look at enthusiasm. What do you when you see enthusiasm? What do you?
Well, I think this time around, and one of the things that I really pull out of this this Gallup research is the fact that people are really not only enthusiastic, but they're paying attention. They're following the campaigns. And although the ratings for the conventions were not off the charts, they were okay, but not overly exciting. People are connected. People are tuned in, and I think one of the difficulties with asking this enthusiasm question is that particularly when you have an incumbent, it doesn't necessarily give you a sense of kind of the anti-enthusiasm for the incumbent. And we know from our polls that a lot of Joe Biden's support is just actually a lot of disapproval and dislike of President Trump. So it's very unlikely that he is going to match the enthusiasm among his supporters, because a lot of the motivation for a lot of people for voting for Joe Biden is simply to not have Trump in office for another 4 years.
But one way or another, people think there's a lot at stake. And then I think that's what we're seeing in the election.
And I think the one thing to keep in mind, and this is coming out of the conventions and looking at enthusiasm, is there's two wild cards. One is coronavirus and what happens in the fall, because the numbers are starting to come down from this summer spike that was unexpected. There was always this expectation it would spike again in the fall. Let's see what happens. But the other part is what's happening in Kenosha, Wisconsin. As we record this. And any additional acts of Black people being killed by police, or protests that turn into riots, all of that storyline is the other, I think, giant wild card here, because Republicans certainly want to use that kind of as a replay. It's a simplistic way to put it, as 1968 Law and Order, and Democrats want to use it to talk about racial justice, which has more appeal in the suburbs, for instance, than it did in 1968. So I think that's a giant wild card, and I'm not sure that any of us are measuring that right now, because I don't think you can measure it right now. I think it has to sink in, and I don't think it's sinking in yet, the changes that may take place. I'm fascinated to see the polls 2 weeks from now, 3 weeks from now, to see if anything is changing.
Well, it'd actually be interesting to see what we're going to be focusing on in 2 or 3 weeks, because so many Americans do get their news from social media. This has been playing a bigger and bigger role, and I think the issues and events that you mentioned, Jay, are prime examples of how people have been motivated to both protest and to really focus on some of these issues. One of the things, though, that we're seeing is that there has been also somewhat of an undermining of how people really feel about what they see on social media. I mean, when we've done these polls for many, many years, people have always kind of put a little question mark against, what they see or hear from social media, not necessarily trusting it. But the number of people who have been getting their news from social media has grown exponentially. And we may say we don't always believe it, but we do grab the headlines do grab our attention, as do the videos, and it's hard to kind of get your way through all of the noise that we are bombarded with from so many different platforms. But this has actually become a polarizing issue as well. Did one of you want to kind of talk about how this is divided up in terms of partisanship?
Yeah, I can talk about it. Basically, we're looking at a recent poll from Pew, and they do great work on media consumption. And we've followed this for many years, because they do lots of long-term research over how people get their news, consume their news, all that kind of stuff. And when they've looked at this over a long period of time, but the most recent numbers, what they show is that 90% of Republicans say it is very likely or somewhat likely that social media sites censor political viewpoints. That's
well, they do. That is a way of centering it if they censor political viewpoints from each side.
This is censoring, though. And then Democrats are at 62%, or 59%, down from 62%. So they come down a little bit, but not much. Basically, it's 90% of Republicans and 60%, 59% of Democrats say that social media sites censor political views. So if anything, it's bipartisan, right? Except there is this big partisan split. Basically, 9 in 10 Republicans, many of whom, because we all do consume at least some news on social media, believe it's being censored.
Do you think this is a social media thing or is it just a media thing?
Well, that's what I wonder is if you ask this question and you put Fox News and MSNBC and CNN and then the broadcast networks and television news in there, or even newspaper, website news, do you get anything different? I mean, it's hard for me to believe that the folks who watch only Fox News, and we know that there's a cohort of people who get all of their news or primary amount from Fox News, that they're going to have a sense that their news is being censored that will be different from people who only watch MSNBC. They're going to think that what they're watching is fair, but if they're watching another network, or they're going to say the other networks are skewed. That we've seen that in other polls, and that seems to be kind of the same thing. It's just that these platforms, if anything, these platforms are not seen as partisan per se, not in the same way that the television networks are, but that they're equally seen by both sides as being kind of unfair, which is different.
And what I find interesting is this debate we're having over what exactly is a fact. Because although in the same poll, 51% of Americans said that they approve of social media companies labeling posts on their platforms from elected officials and as inaccurate or misleading, 27% of Republicans felt that way, but 73% of Democrats did. So there's this alternative facts world. Are we ever going to get to the point where we're actually agreeing on what is true?
I just have to wonder about whether this is just social media becoming of age, and whether we have the dawning of an era which is yet to have played out. I mean, I'm the fuddy-duddy amongst us, and I always go back and when we had broadcast media or major newspaper was the mode of communication. Well, you had editors who would be filtering things and providing that kind of direction as to what matters, what's important, what's not important. And now we come to an era where you have, the president, as Twitter in chief and all social media around it. And if there's going to be some censoring, I don't even know who's doing that. I mean, where's that coming from? What has happened to modern journalism if, in fact, the information we're getting is free from anybody or could be from any source? And so I think it's just an era where we just haven't kind of figured out what this is all about yet. And as a result, people are very skeptical.
It reminds me a little bit of that slide I used to show in the class that I did for you, Lee, once a semester about the number of people who got some news from social media, the percentage, and the percentage of people who distrusted it. It was like, 70% or whatever the number was, get a lot of their news from social media, and they all distrust it. And I always ask that question in classes, what the heck's going on? Why would you keep going to a source that you distrust? And none of us had any good answers. I don't think the students had any good answers to either. It was more of one of those questions that is unanswerable right now.
Yeah,
because it's there. That's why we climb mountains, and that's why we look at social media.
Or it is what it is. That's the other.
I've heard all those things. Okay, who wants to wrap it up? I don't want to wrap up.
That will do it for this edition of Poll Hub. Poll Hub is a production of the Marist Poll at Marist College in Poughkeepsie, New York, although as you know, only some of us are there in Poughkeepsie, New York, as Marist College has opened just this week with students on campus, which we are very excited about. So we have been visiting our home base and keeping social distance, as some of us are in other places. Mary Griffith is our executive producer, Casey Schaff is our editor, and Amelia Morell is our production assistant.
No longer with Hudson, though, because Hudson's at home and Amelia's at Marist. So
that's right.
Yeah. Oh, there goes the crying towel. Anyway, yeah. We're going to thank the Roper Center, as we always do at Cornell, for their archival work. We're going to have our students in our new internship
College to career, Lee, that's what you're looking at.
College to careers. We had so many C words. We're going to be working with the Roper Center stuff also, so that's really great. And they give us the time to look back at things. So some of our judgments and information is formed by what we see in information that's come before. Like even how many people were watching TVs in 1948 and 52? as opposed to now.
I'm going to go with not many without even having to look at the Roper Center. If you've got questions or comments, you've got things you'd like to find out about or questions you'd like us to ask, for instance, in polls, hit us up on social media. We're on Facebook and Instagram and on Twitter, all at Marist Poll. Also, if you're interested in some of the things we talk about, we tell you about the Academy every week, the Marist Poll Academy, available on our website. There's a tab up at the top. It's a free online learning source. It gives you an opportunity to dig into polling in a lot more detail. And if you like what you hear on Poll Hub, please consider leaving a positive review. It's the best way for people who are searching for podcasts to find a new one. And if you like what you hear, other people might like it too. So leave a positive review. They'll find us, and you'll have more people listening to us along with you. And that's always great because it's good to have a big family. Stay safe out there, and we'll see you next time.